branded Housekeeper and denied a seat. I chose revenge and burned his cheating world down. At my husband's sister's engagement, the tag on my chest read, Housekeeper. His mother smirked. "You're just staff here? No chair, no plate, no place?" My husband chuckled. "Food is for family." I stood tall, slid off my ring, and said, "Then I'm no longer yours." His smile vanished. But that was only the beginning. Alexander didn't know I was home when he called his mother from our bedroom. "Mom's right. You need to learn your position," he said, and I froze outside the door holding the laundry basket. The housekeeper badge is perfect. Maybe after this, Victoria will stop pretending her little business matters. He laughed, actually laughed, about how his partners would enjoy seeing me taken down a notch at Zoe's engagement party. I set down the basket silently, walked to my home office, and opened the folder I'd labeled insurance. Inside were 6 months of documented evidence of Alexander's embezzlement from his firm. I'd hoped never to use it. Now I began drafting an anonymous SEC whistleblower report, while my husband planned my humiliation in the next room. Before we continue, if you've ever been dismissed or undervalued by those who should have supported you, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us share these stories of resilience and justice. Now, let's see how deep this betrayal goes. The laundry basket contained his Brooks Brothers shirts, each one pressed perfectly the way he demanded, with exactly 1 inch of starch in the collar. I'd been doing his laundry for 5 years, not because we couldn't afford help, but because Alexander insisted it showed proper wifely devotion, the same devotion that had me wake at 5:45 every morning to prepare his Colombian coffee while reviewing quarterly reports for failing businesses I was restructuring. He never knew that while he slept, I was saving Chicago restaurants from bankruptcy, negotiating with creditors, and building financial models that would determine whether families kept their livelihoods. My home office had become a command center over the past 3 years. 2 monitors displayed spreadsheets for Romano's restaurant, which was hemorrhaging $30,000 monthly. Tony Romano had called me crying last week, saying his father would roll over in his grave if he knew the family business was failing. I'd already identified their problems. Food costs at 47% when they should be under 30%. 3 vendors overcharging them because nobody had renegotiated contracts in a decade, and a menu that hadn't adapted to neighborhood demographics that had shifted from Italian families to young professionals wanting quick lunch options. I'd fix it all for a fraction of what the big consulting firms charged, but according to Alexander, this was just my little hobby. The insurance folder felt heavier than its actual weight. 6 months ago, I'd noticed discrepancies in Alexander's home office files. He'd grown careless, leaving Lakeshore Capital documents on his desk, assuming I was too focused on my little business to understand complex financial instruments. But I understood them better than he did. Line items that didn't match. Portfolio company expenses that were actually personal charges. Investor funds diverted to accounts that traced back to Alexander's control. Classic embezzlement dressed up in private equity jargon. I'd photographed everything, created encrypted backups, and consulted quietly with Margaret Brennan, a former federal prosecutor who now handled corporate litigation. "This is criminal," she'd said simply. "When you're ready, this ends his career." I'd hoped that day would never come. Marriage meant protecting each other even from their own crimes. But apparently, marriage to Alexander meant planning my public humiliation while I pressed his shirts. From the bedroom, his voice carried clear. "The engagement party will be perfect. Zoe's marrying into serious money with Daniel, and it's time Victoria understood the difference between real success and playing businesswoman." Serafina's laugh tinkled through the phone speaker. They discussed details, how the name badge would be waiting at check-in, how there would be no chair at our table, how they'd make sure everyone noticed I wasn't being served food. "She saved your father's company," Serafina admitted, "but that doesn't make her family. Help is help no matter how well dressed." 18 months ago, that help had worked 16-hour days to save Hawthorne Manufacturing from bankruptcy. Richard Hawthorne, Alexander's father, had built the company over 30 years, but COVID had exposed every weakness in their operations. Traditional consultants wanted $400,000 just to assess the situation. I restructured everything for $130,000, pivoting their production to ventilator components when the market demanded it, renegotiating union contracts without triggering strikes, and identifying inefficiencies that were costing them $200,000 monthly. I saved 200 jobs. Blue-collar workers with mortgages and kids in college kept their paychecks, because I understood manufacturing logistics better than consultants who'd never set foot on a factory floor. Serafina had visited once during the restructuring, wrinkling her nose at the break room where I ate lunch with line supervisors. "These people," she'd said, not bothering to lower her voice. "This is so beneath the Hawthorne name. Yet the Hawthorne name only survived because I prevented bankruptcy." Thursday dinners at Serafina's Gold Coast mansion had become a masterclass in endurance. Every week at 7:00 p.m. sharp, I arrived with homemade dessert, usually her favorite lemon tart that took 3 hours to perfect. She'd take one bite, declare it acceptable, then spend the meal dissecting my shortcomings. Victoria is keeping busy with her little consulting project. She'd tell her friends, emphasis on little and project like I was a child with a lemonade stand. Meanwhile, Nexus Advisory had just crossed 7 figures in annual revenue. I built my company from our dining room table with $5,000 in savings and desperation that tasted metallic. 50 cold calls to failing restaurants, 49 rejections, 1 yes from Yepes Pizzeria, and he only agreed because I offered the first consultation free. His daughter had rolled her eyes when I walked in, young female, nothing like the gray-suited consultants they'd expected. But numbers don't lie. I reduced their costs by 35% without sacrificing quality, modernized their ordering system, and taught them social media marketing that brought in customers under 40 for the first time in years. Yeppe told everyone. His cousin who owned a steakhouse, the Lebanese bakery across the street, the gastropub that was 3 weeks from closing. Within 6 months, I had 8 clients. Within a year, I hired James Fitzgerald from Deloitte because I couldn't handle the volume alone. Now I had 17 active restructuring projects and a waiting list of businesses willing to pay premium rates for resurrection. But to Alexander, success meant Lakeshore Capital, meant partner meetings in glass towers, meant other people's money-generating returns through financial engineering that created nothing real. My success, saving actual businesses, preserving actual jobs, was just my little project that kept me occupied while he did real business. I saved the draft of the SEC complaint and opened a new document. This one would be different. A timeline of every financial crime, every falsified document, every investor defrauded. Margaret Brennan would file it Monday morning if needed. The engagement party was Saturday. By then, Alexander would learn that some positions couldn't be taught through humiliation. Some positions were earned through competence, integrity, and the ability to destroy someone using their own crimes against them. His call ended with promises to his mother about how entertaining Saturday would be. I closed my laptop and returned to the laundry, folding his shirts with the same precision I applied to forensic accounting, each crease perfect, each collar exactly as he demanded. The devoted wife maintaining her perfect position while planning the complete destruction of the man who thought he could diminish her in front of Chicago's financial elite. The housekeeper badge would be his masterpiece of cruelty, but the SEC filing would be mine. 2 weeks later, on a gray Tuesday afternoon that threatened rain, Zoe showed up at our townhouse without calling first. She stood on our doorstep with mascara streaking down her cheeks, her usually perfect blonde hair pulled into a messy bun, wearing sweatpants and a Northwestern hoodie that made her look like the college student she'd been before Daniel Morrison swept her into his world of tech startups and venture capital promises. "I think I'm making a terrible mistake," she said, and I pulled her inside before any neighbors could see a Hawthorne crying in public. God forbid word got back to Serafina that her youngest daughter had shown weakness where people might witness it. We sat in my kitchen while I made tea, proper tea with loose leaves in a pot, not the bags Alexander insisted were fine. Zoe's engagement ring caught the light, 3 carats surrounded by smaller diamonds, the kind of ring that announced wealth before the wearer even spoke. She twisted it around her finger like it was burning her. "Daniel wants to get married next month," she said, her voice small. "He says there's no point waiting, that we should just do it before his company goes public. He gets angry when I suggest waiting until spring." I kept my face neutral while my mind raced. Daniel Morrison ran a fintech startup called Pure Metrics that claimed to revolutionize payment processing for small businesses. Alexander had mentioned it twice at dinner, impressed by their growth numbers. But something in Zoe's voice made my consultant instincts flare. "Tell me about the anger," I said carefully, pouring her tea. "It's not real anger. It's pressure. Like when he showed me the prenup his lawyers drafted. Apparently, I need to sign away rights to his company, any future companies, and agree to confidentiality about his business dealings. When I asked to have my own lawyer review it, He said I was being dramatic. That night after Zoe left, I did what Zoe left. I did what I do best: research. Daniel's company showed impressive metrics on paper: 2 million users, 40% quarter-over-quarter growth, partnerships with 3 major banks. But I knew how to read between the numbers. My contacts at the banks had never heard of pure metrics. The user growth followed patterns I'd seen in fraudulent companies: too linear, too consistent, lacking the organic fluctuations of real adoption. By morning, I had the truth. Daniel was inflating metrics to secure his Series B funding. The 2 million users were mostly bots. The banking partnerships were letters of intent, not actual contracts. His company was 3 months from imploding, and he needed to marry Zoe quickly to lock down her trust fund as emergency runway. I documented everything in a secure folder, but telling Zoe would require timing. She needed to discover this naturally, not have her defensive about her choices. 3 days after Zoe's visit, Serafina called me directly. She never called Alexander about money, only me. "Victoria, darling," she began, which meant she wanted something expensive. "There's been a small hiccup with the estate taxes from Richard's passing. Richard had been dead for 2 years. Estate taxes were long settled. It's rather urgent," she continued. $50,000 due by month's end. My divorce settlement is tied up in some tedious legal matter. You understand how these things go." I understood perfectly. The woman who just posted Instagram photos from her St. Bart's vacation, who'd bought a new Range Rover last month, who wore different Cartier watches to each Thursday dinner, needed $50,000 for imaginary taxes. "Of course," I said smoothly. "Send me the tax documentation and I'll handle the payment directly to the IRS." Silence. Then, "Oh, it's easier if you just transfer it to my account. I'll handle the paperwork." I agreed, transferred the money, and immediately hired a forensic accountant through my company. What he found was remarkable. During her divorce from Richard's brother, William, Serafina had hidden $2.3 million in Cayman Islands accounts. She'd claimed poverty in court, walking away with massive alimony payments while sitting on a fortune that should have been split. The $50,000 I just sent was probably funding her next shopping spree while she played the victim of bureaucratic delays. Meanwhile, Alexander had become a ghost in our marriage. 3 months ago, he'd missed our anniversary dinner, claiming an emergency with a portfolio company. I'd sat alone at Gibson's Steakhouse, watching the candle burn down while the waiter tried not to look pitying. On my birthday last month, he'd forgotten entirely until his assistant reminded him at 4 p.m. Then, he'd sent grocery store flowers with a generic card. But the Friday meetings were what really told the story. Every Friday for 3 months, Alexander had emergency partner meetings at the Palmer House Hotel. He'd leave his phone in the car, claiming the partners demanded complete focus. He'd returned smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. Chanel No. 5, expensive and cliché. His collar would have makeup traces he tried to wipe away. His credit card statements, which I handled because he couldn't be bothered with administrative tasks, showed charges for room service for 2, champagne, and breakfast. I knew her name. Rebecca Lansing, senior associate at Lakeshore Capital, Harvard MBA, engaged to someone else but apparently flexible about exclusivity. I had photos from the hotel security footage my investigator procured. They were damning and clear, but I filed them away with the embezzlement evidence, building my arsenal while pretending to be the oblivious wife focused on her little business. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, hand-delivered by courier. Gold embossing on cream cardstock so thick it could stand on its own. "The honor of your presence is requested at the engagement celebration of Zoe L. Hawthorne and Daniel Morrison," addressed to Mr. Alexander Hawthorne. Only him. "Where's mine?" I asked at dinner, holding the invitation. Alexander barely glanced up from his phone where he was probably texting Rebecca about their next Friday meeting. "Mom probably forgot to include your name. You know how she is with details." Serafina Hawthorne had never forgotten a detail in her life. She remembered the thread count of her sheets, the vintage of wines served at dinners 3 years ago, and exactly how much everyone's jewelry cost at every event. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was deliberate. "Should I please reply for both of us?" I asked, testing him. "Obviously you're coming," he said, finally looking at me with irritation that I'd interrupted whatever flirtation he was conducting via text. "Just wear something understated, so you don't outshine the bride. Something understated like I was the kind of woman who would show up to his sister's engagement party in sequins and steal attention." like my very presence needed to be diminished, made smaller, less noticeable, like I should practice being invisible before they made it official with a name badge. That night, I stood in our closet looking at my clothes. The DVF dresses he'd once said made me look like I belonged. The St. John's suits I wore to client meetings. The careful, calculated wardrobe of a woman trying to fit into a world that had already decided she didn't belong. I pulled out a black dress, simple and elegant, the kind of thing you could wear to a business dinner or a funeral. It would be perfect for what was coming. Saturday arrived wrapped in late September chill, the kind that made you reach for a coat but then realize you'd look overdressed. I stood in front of our bedroom mirror at 6:30, the black dress hanging perfectly, my makeup applied with the precision of someone preparing for battle rather than celebration. The exhaustion I saw reflected back went deeper than sleepless nights reviewing spreadsheets. This was the bone-deep weariness of maintaining a marriage that had become performance art. Alexander had left 2 hours earlier for client drinks before the party, the same client drinks that required cologne reapplication and a fresh shirt. Even though he'd supposedly been at the office all day, he'd kissed my cheek absently, told me not to wait for him, that he'd meet me at Crystal Gardens. The casual cruelty of making me arrive alone to his sister's engagement party didn't even register on his face. I drove myself in the Mercedes, winding through Lincoln Park toward the venue. The car still smelled faintly of the leather conditioning Alexander insisted on monthly. Another one of those details that mattered more than whether his wife had someone to walk in with. At every red light, I checked my phone, confirming James Fitzgerald had received the encrypted files, that Margaret Brennan was on standby, that my documenting of this evening would be admissible if needed. Crystal Gardens' valet lot was already full of cars that cost more than most people's houses. I pulled in between a white Bentley and a black Maserati, both probably belonging to Alexander's partners, who viewed marriages as merger opportunities and wives as either assets or liabilities on their social balance sheets. The valet was young, maybe 22, probably working his way through college. He took my keys with the kind of deference reserved for people who could afford to be here. Inside, the lobby gleamed with that particular combination of marble and ambition that characterized Chicago's elite venues. Clusters of Alexander's colleagues stood near the bar, and I heard my name drift from their conversation. "That's the one who thinks she's a business consultant," someone said, not quite quietly enough. "Alexander lets her play with that little company of hers." They laughed, the sound sharp as champagne flutes clinking. I walked past them toward the check-in table, my heels clicking against marble with metronomic precision. Each step was deliberate, controlled, the walk of someone who belonged even when every whisper suggested otherwise. The table was draped in ivory linen, attended by a young woman wearing pearls that probably cost more than her monthly salary. "Victoria Hawthorne," I said clearly. She smiled, began flipping through her list. The smile faltered. She flipped again, running her manicured finger down the names. A third time, slower now, and I watched pink creep up her neck. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat the name?" "Victoria Hawthorne, Hawthorne." She looked up at me with genuine distress, then down at something beneath the table. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a badge tucked separately from the others. She slid it across the marble counter just as Serafina materialized beside me in champagne-colored Chanel, timed with the precision of someone who'd been watching for this exact moment. The badge read Victoria Housekeeper in elegant script. "Oh, Victoria," Serafina announced, her voice pitched to carry across the lobby. "You're just staff here." The words landed like a judge's verdict. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Investment bankers turned from their whiskey. Hedge fund managers paused their networking. 300 of Chicago's financial elite suddenly had their evening's entertainment watching Serafina Hawthorne publicly designate her daughter-in-law as hired help. "Behind me," someone whispered. "The one who saved Hawthorne Manufacturing?" Another voice responded. "Apparently, she's the housekeeper now. Someone actually took a photo with their phone." I picked up the badge, studying it like evidence in a deposition. The cardstock was expensive, the printing professional. This wasn't a last-minute error. This had been ordered weeks ago, approved, paid for, and deliberately separated from the guest badges. "Shall I escort you to the service entrance?" Serafina asked sweetly. "The staff usually enters through the back." I clipped the badge to my dress with steady hands and walked into the ballroom. Table 3 was positioned perfectly for maximum visibility, close enough to the head table for importance, far enough from the exit to prevent discreet departure. 7 chairs surrounded 8 place settings, the gap where my seat should have been screamed louder than any announcement. The empty space had been carefully maintained. No one had accidentally shifted the chairs to fill it. This was architectural humiliation. I stood beside the void where my place should have been, watching Serafina's friends notice the missing chair, see my badge, and understand tonight's entertainment. The mayor's wife actually gasped. A federal judge's husband took out his phone to text someone, probably sharing the delicious gossip of Victoria Hawthorne's public demotion. Alexander arrived 40 minutes later, and yes, I was still standing. He swept in with the confidence of someone who'd had exactly 3 whiskeys, enough for courage, but not enough to slur. His collar had lipstick traces he hadn't bothered to check. Rebecca's shade, that coral pink she wore to every company event, the smell of her Chanel No. 5 clouded around him like evidence. He saw me standing, saw the missing chair, saw his mother's satisfied smile, saw his partners from Lakeshore Capital watching from 2 tables over, and he laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an uncomfortable laugh, a genuine, amused laugh like someone had told a particularly clever joke. "Relax, Victoria," he said, reaching for the wine already poured at his place setting. "Food is for family." 5 years of marriage, 3 years of building a company that saved businesses, 18 months ago rescuing his father's entire manufacturing legacy, and I wasn't family enough for a chair, for a plate, for basic dignity in front of people whose respect he desperately craved. I felt that crystalline moment of clarity that comes when a marriage dies. Not the slow death of falling out of love, but the instant death of realizing you were never loved at all. I was an accessory that had become inconvenient, a supporting actress who'd forgotten she wasn't supposed to have her own storylines. I reached for my wedding ring, the 2-carat diamond Alexander had chosen to impress his partners rather than please me. The metal was warm from my skin, familiar after 5 years of never taking it off. I pulled it off with deliberate slowness, letting the overhead lights catch every facet of the diamond. The movement drew attention. Conversations at nearby tables stopped. Someone actually set down their fork mid-bite. I placed the ring on the white tablecloth with a precision that made the soft click echo. The sound carried further than it should have, silencing tables in expanding ripples like dropped stones in still water. "Then I'm no longer yours," I said, my voice clear and carrying. Alexander's laugh died. His face went through a series of expressions, confusion, embarrassment, then the dawning realization that I was serious, that his wife had just removed her wedding ring in front of Chicago's entire financial ecosystem, that the woman he designated as the housekeeper had just quit her position. I turned and walked toward the exit, my heels marking each step against the marble. Behind me, chaos erupted. Chairs scraping, voices rising, Serafina's sharp "Alexander, do something." But I didn't turn around. 300 members of Chicago's elite would remember this night, would tell the story at other parties, would wonder what kind of man laughed while his wife stood without a chair. They thought they'd witnessed the culmination. They were wrong. This was just the opening act. The parking garage at Crystal Gardens was eerily quiet after the chaos I'd left behind. My hands were steady on the Mercedes steering wheel, steadier than they'd been in months of pretending everything was fine. I pulled out my phone and called James Fitzgerald. 3 rings. He picked up even though it was nearly 9 on a Saturday night. "Execute Project Revelation," I said without preamble. There was a pause, just a heartbeat. Then his voice came through clear and professional, confirming execution of Project Revelation. Asset freeze protocols initiating now. Document preservation complete. SEC filing prepared for submission. 6 months ago, I'd sat in James's office with a banker's box of evidence, copies of Alexander's doctored reports, diverted funds, investor money traced to personal accounts. James had reviewed everything with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent 10 years at Deloitte before joining my firm. "This is prison-level fraud," he'd said quietly. We'd built Project Revelation that day, a complete response plan for when, not if, Alexander's betrayal became unbearable. "The accounts will be frozen within the hour," James continued. "Our forensic accountant has everything documented. Margaret Brennan has been notified." I drove home through the quiet streets of Lincoln Park, passing houses where normal families were having normal Saturday nights. No public humiliation, no housekeeper badges, no missing chairs at family tables. The townhouse was dark when I arrived. Of course, Alexander hadn't come home. He was probably still at Crystal Gardens trying to explain to his partners why his wife had just staged a public separation at a society event. I poured myself exactly 1 glass of wine and opened my laptop in the home office. The SEC's whistleblower portal loaded slowly like it was giving me time to reconsider. I didn't need time. Each file I uploaded was tagged meticulously. Lakeshore Capital Fund 3 misallocation, personal expense documentation, falsified portfolio company reports. 27 files in total, each one a nail in the professional coffin Alexander had built himself. My phone buzzed. Alexander. I let it ring through to voicemail. Then again and again. By the 5th call, I was curious enough to check the caller ID. Different numbers, his office line, his cell, the partner's conference room. By midnight, I had 17 missed calls. I finally listened to the voicemail he'd left after attempt number 12. Victoria, this is ridiculous. Whatever point you're trying to make, you've made it. Call me back. His voice was controlled, lawyerly, the tone he used with difficult clients. The 13th call's message was different. We need to discuss this rationally. You're emotional. Let's talk through whatever's bothering you. By the 16th message, desperation had crept in. The partners are asking questions. Do you understand what you're doing? You're destroying everything we've built, everything we'd built, as if he'd contributed anything to my company beyond condescension, as if his embezzlement and affairs were building rather than destroying. At 5:30 Sunday morning, my doorbell rang. Margaret Brennan stood on my porch in a pristine suit despite the ungodly hour, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's rent. She'd driven straight from her Lake Forest home after James's call. Let's review your options, she said, spreading manila folders across my dining room table like she was dealing cards in the world's highest-stakes poker game. The first folder contained Alexander's greatest hits of infidelity. Photos from the Palmer House Hotel, time-stamped credit card receipts, sworn affidavit from hotel staff who'd been paid to look the other way. Rebecca Lansing featured prominently, but she wasn't alone. There was Jennifer from the Hong Kong trip, Maria from the Miami conference, each documented with the precision of someone building a case. The prenuptial agreement's infidelity clause is ironclad, Margaret explained, tapping a specific paragraph with her manicured nail. Full forfeiture of marital asset claims, plus damages for reputational harm. He gets nothing from your company, nothing from your accounts, and he owes you compensation. The second folder was even more damaging. Lakeshore Capital's fraudulent fund allocations laid out in spreadsheet clarity. Investor money diverted to personal accounts, then cleverly disguised as portfolio company expenses. Classic embezzlement wearing a private equity costume. This is federal crime territory, Margaret said quietly. Once the SEC receives this, there's no stopping the investigation. His partners will distance themselves immediately. Criminal charges are likely. The third folder contained my nuclear option. Serafina's hidden offshore accounts. $2 million that should have been split in her divorce, hidden in the Caymans while she cried poverty to the court. Her ex-husband's attorney would find this very interesting. Margaret noted the clawback provisions alone would bankrupt her. We worked through each document, each strategy, each potential outcome. Margaret had the kind of thorough preparation that came from 20 years of destroying wealthy men who thought they were untouchable. By the time she left at noon, I had a clear path forward. It would be brutal, methodical, and entirely legal. That evening, still Sunday, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, then noticed the 847 area code, Northwestern University. Victoria. The voice was small, scared. It's Zoe. I'm in your lobby. Can I come up? She stood at my door 5 minutes later, looking destroyed. Pajama pants under a Northwestern sweatshirt, no makeup, mascara streak still visible from crying. In her hands, she clutched printed pages with highlighting and handwritten notes in the margins. I researched Daniel's company, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. After what you said about checking things, the numbers don't add up. I made tea while she spread her research across my kitchen counter. She'd done good work, better than I'd expected from someone with no financial background, user growth charts that showed impossible patterns, partnership announcements that led to dead websites, employee LinkedIn profiles for people who didn't exist. It's all fake, isn't it? She asked, looking at me with eyes that already knew the answer. We sat on my kitchen floor, backs against the cabinets, sharing tea and truth. I explained how I discovered the fraud, why I'd waited to tell her, how Daniel was using their engagement to access her trust fund before his company collapsed. "You were protecting me," she said slowly, "while Mom was calling you the housekeeper, while Alexander was—" She trailed off, fresh tears starting. "You were the only one who was ever kind to me," I told her honestly. "When I married Alexander, you welcomed me. You never made me feel like I didn't belong. You were the only one who actually acted like family," she whispered. We talked until nearly midnight, planning how she'd confront Daniel, how she'd protect herself legally and financially. I gave her Margaret Brennan's card, promising to cover the legal fees myself. When she finally left, she hugged me with the desperation of someone who'd just realized how alone she'd been in her own family. I stood in my empty townhouse afterward, surrounded by the evidence of systematic betrayal and calculated cruelty. Tomorrow, the documents would be filed, the accounts would be frozen, the investigations would begin, the Hawthorne family empire would start its collapse. But tonight, in my kitchen with Zoe, I'd remembered why I was doing this. Not just for revenge, though that would be satisfying, but because someone had to protect the people they claimed to love while destroying. Someone had to be the family they pretended to be. Monday morning arrived with a kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper, clearer. I was already at my desk when the first domino fell at exactly 8 o'clock. My phone buzzed with a voicemail notification from a number I knew well, Serafina's private line. I played it on speaker while reviewing my morning emails. "You vindictive little nobody," her voice crackled through the speaker, high-pitched and frantic. "How dare you? Do you have any idea what you've done? William's attorney just served me papers. They know about the Cayman accounts. They know everything." The message continued for 3 more minutes, alternating between threats of legal action and desperate attempts at negotiation. She used words I'd never heard from her perfectly painted lips before. The polished Gold Coast matron had cracked completely, revealing the desperate woman underneath who'd hidden $2 million while claiming she couldn't afford groceries during her divorce. I deleted the voicemail and opened an email from Margaret Brennan. The subject line read, simply, "Clawback initiated." William's attorney had filed emergency motions that morning. Serafina's accounts were frozen pending investigation. She owed $800,000 in penalties plus the original $2 million she'd concealed. Her Range Rover would be repossessed by week's end. At 9:15, my phone rang. James Fitzgerald calling from his car. "You need to see something," he said without greeting. "Check your email. Security footage from Lakeshore Capitol just leaked. The video was grainy but clear enough. Alexander in his corner office at 7:43 that morning reading something on his computer screen. His face went from confused to panicked to enraged in the span of 30 seconds. Then he picked up his laptop and hurled it against the glass wall of his office with enough force to leave a spiderweb crack. The sound of shattering technology mixed with his screaming at his assistant to get his lawyer immediately. What the security footage captured next was even more damaging. 3 junior analysts standing frozen in the hallway, phones raised, recording their boss's complete breakdown. Alexander screaming obscenities, papers flying, him trying to call someone, probably me, and throwing his phone when I didn't answer. "It's already viral," James said. #Hawthorne meltdown. Every financial blog in Chicago has picked it up. By noon, the video had been viewed 40,000 times. Someone had set it to classical music, making Alexander's rage look even more unhinged against Vivaldi's 4 Seasons. The comment section was brutal. Former employees sharing stories about his temper, competitors questioning his stability, investors asking if this was who they trusted with their pension funds. I watched it once, noting the exact moment the SEC notice must have appeared on his screen. That would be the formal notification of investigation into Lakeshore Capital's fund allocations, the moment he realized his career was over, that prison was a real possibility, that his perfectly crafted image had shattered like his laptop screen. Wednesday arrived with its own special delivery of consequences. Serafina called me 6 times before noon, each message more desperate than the last. I didn't answer, but Zoe forwarded me the text their mother had sent to the family group chat. "The Chicago Athletic Club has made a terrible mistake. Some confusion about finances. This will be resolved immediately." But there was no confusion. The club had suspended her membership pending resolution of her legal troubles. The same establishment where she'd held court for 20 years, where she'd served on committees and organized galas, had politely but firmly exiled her. Her Wednesday tennis partner, Dorothy Whitfield, had reportedly walked past her in the lobby without acknowledgement. The same woman who'd been Serafina's maid of honor at her wedding to William now pretended they'd never met. Zoe called me that afternoon, her voice a mixture of shock and something close to satisfaction. Mom showed up for her tennis match and they had her locker contents boxed in the lobby, she said. Security escorted her out. Everyone saw. Mrs. Chin actually took a photo. The mighty Serafina Hawthorne, reduced to carrying a cardboard box of tennis whites and designer athletic wear through a lobby full of people she'd once considered beneath her notice. The Chicago society pages would feast on this for months. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor. James arrived at my home office with a folder and an expression I'd learned to recognize. He'd found an opportunity in chaos. Crystal Gardens is in trouble, he said, spreading financial statements across my desk. The venue's hemorrhaging money, bad management, worse contracts. They're looking for a buyer before they go under. I studied the numbers. The same venue where I'd been labeled the Housekeeper was now begging for rescue. The irony was delicious enough to taste. How much? I asked. They're asking $2 million. They'll take $800,000 cash, 40 cents on the dollar. We could run it through the shell company, make it a Nexus Advisory acquisition. $800,000 to own the site of my humiliation, to control the space where 300 people had witnessed my degradation, to ensure no one else would ever endure what I had experienced there. Draw up the papers, I said without hesitation. James smiled, the kind of expression that reminded me why I'd hired him from Deloitte. He understood that revenge was just business by another name. I've already started. We can close by month's end. Full transfer of assets including their existing event contracts. Serafina's charity gala is booked there for December. The charity gala, Serafina's crown jewel event, the one she spent all year planning, where she proved her social relevance by raising money for causes she couldn't pronounce correctly. She'd already sent invitations. The deposits were paid, and soon I'd own the venue. We'll honor existing contracts, I said carefully, with some modifications to policies. James raised an eyebrow. Modifications? New rules. No degrading name badges, no missing chairs, no class distinctions in service. Everyone who enters gets treated with equal dignity, and Serafina's gala will proceed as planned. She'll just have to follow the new policies, and perhaps we'll display the venue's ownership prominently, for transparency. That afternoon, I signed the initial papers while thinking about the badge that still sat in my desk drawer, the one that read Victoria Housekeeper. Soon, I'd own the building where that humiliation occurred. I'd control the space where Alexander laughed at my missing chair. I'd decide who was welcome and who wasn't. The acquisition documents felt heavier than their actual weight, loaded with the promise of transformation. Crystal Gardens would become something different under my ownership, a place where respect wasn't determined by bank accounts or bloodlines, where every person who entered would be treated as equally valuable, where no one would ever stand beside an empty chair while their spouse laughed. As James gathered the papers to file with our attorneys, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it to find a message from Rebecca Lansing, Alexander's mistress. He's been calling me non-stop, begging for help. I thought you should know I'm testifying to the SEC tomorrow. I kept records of everything, the gifts, the trips, all paid with investor funds. I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. Even his mistress was abandoning ship. The dominoes weren't just falling anymore. They were accelerating, each collapse triggering the next with beautiful precision. I stared at Rebecca's text for a moment longer before setting my phone aside. Tomorrow, she would testify to the SEC, and Alexander's last potential lifeline would be severed. The irony that his mistress would show more integrity than he ever had wasn't lost on me. I pulled up the emails from the 3 portfolio companies where Nexus Advisory held consulting contracts through Lakeshore Capital's agreements. Each CEO owed their company's survival to my restructuring work, though Alexander had taken credit for sourcing exceptional consultants at every partner's meeting. Friday morning, I sent identical emails to all 3 CEOs. The message was simple. Evidence of fund misallocation affecting your companies. Urgent board review recommended. Documentation attached. By 9:30, my phone was ringing off the hook. Michael Chin from Pinnacle Tech was first. Victoria, these documents. Is this real? Alexander's been charging personal expenses to our operational budget. Every receipt is authenticated, I told him. Your last quarter's unusually high consulting fees actually paid for his Palmer House hotel stays. The emergency board meeting at Lakeshore Capital convened at 11 o'clock. I wasn't there, but Michael Chin called me from the bathroom during a break, whispering like he was sharing state secrets. "It's chaos." He said the limited partners are losing their minds. Someone calculated that Alexander misallocated $3.2 million over 18 months. They're talking criminal prosecution. By 3 o'clock, it was over. Alexander was placed on indefinite leave, his equity stake frozen pending investigation, and his company access revoked immediately. The security footage that leaked later showed him packing personal items into a cardboard box while 2 guards watched, ensuring he didn't take any files. The same corner office where he'd thrown his laptop now hosted his professional funeral. His assistant apparently wouldn't make eye contact as he left. That evening, Zoe called me sobbing, but they were different tears than before. These carried relief mixed with anger. "I confronted Daniel with everything," she said, her voice steadier than I'd expected. At first, he denied it, said I was being paranoid, that I didn't understand startup metrics. Then I showed him the evidence you helped me compile. She described how Daniel had crumbled completely, falling to his knees in their Lincoln Park apartment, admitting he'd inflated Pure Metrics user numbers by 90%. The 2 million users were mostly bots he'd purchased from a Romanian developer. The banking partnerships existed only in draft proposals. Everything was designed to secure funding before the truth emerged. He kept saying he could make it right. Zoe continued, disgust creeping into her voice, as if fraud could be fixed with good intentions. He actually suggested we get married quickly so I couldn't testify against him. She'd ended the engagement via group text to avoid individual confrontations with people who'd only befriended her for her trust fund. The message was brief. "Wedding's off. Please don't contact me." Her phone had exploded with messages ranging from fake concern to angry demands for explanation. She'd blocked them all. "You saved me from becoming a federal defendant's wife," she said quietly. "From visiting him in prison, from having my assets seized, from losing everything to his crimes." At 2 o'clock in the morning, my doorbell camera detected motion. The alert on my phone showed Alexander standing on my porch, swaying slightly. His Brooks Brothers suit, usually pristine, was wrinkled and stained. His tie hung loose around his neck. He looked like what he was, a man whose entire world had collapsed in less than a week. "Victoria!" he shouted loud enough to wake neighbors. "Open the door. We need to talk." I watched through the camera feed as he alternated between pounding on the door and leaning against it for support. The recording would be perfect evidence for the restraining order Margaret Brennan would file at courthouse opening. "I know you're watching," he slurred, looking directly at the camera. "You think you've won? I'll destroy your little company. I'll tell everyone what you really are." What I really was, a woman who'd saved his family's business, supported his career, and built her own success despite his constant diminishment. The threat might have scared me once. Now it was just pathetic noise from a man who'd lost all his power. "We can work this out," he continued, his tone shifting to desperate pleading. "It was just a joke, the badge thing. Mom's idea. You know I love you. Love." He threw the word around like it meant something, like it could erase the housekeeper badge, the missing chair, the laughter when I stood without a place at the table. Through the camera, I watched him slide down to sit on the porch steps, his head in his hands. The mighty Alexander Hawthorne, reduced to drunk, begging on the doorstep of the woman he tried to humiliate. After 20 minutes, he finally left, stumbling toward an Uber that charged the credit card I hadn't yet removed my name from. I'd fix that in the morning, along with filing the restraining order. For now, I had 20 minutes of recorded evidence of harassment, threats, and trespassing. Saturday afternoon brought the most unexpected revelation. James had been tracking the Hawthorne family's financial collapse through his network of contacts. What he discovered about Serafina's current situation exceeded even my expectations for poetic justice. "She's working as a receptionist," he told me over coffee in my home office, at a dental practice in Naperville. $15 an hour plus benefits. The woman who declared me just staff was now actually working as staff. The woman who'd said food was for family was probably bringing packed lunches to save money. The woman who'd measured worth in designer labels and trust fund zeros was taking public transportation because her Range Rover had been repossessed Thursday morning. "She's living in a one-bedroom apartment near the metro station," James continued, showing me property records on his tablet. $1,200 a month. Her Gold Coast mansion was seized yesterday for the fraud penalties. I thought about Serafina sitting behind a reception desk. scheduling appointments for people who didn't know she used to host charity galas in that same suburb, answering phones with the same voice that had announced to 300 people that I was the housekeeper, filing insurance forms for the kind of middle-class families she'd once considered beneath her notice. The other receptionists apparently have no idea who she used to be, James added. She goes by Sarah now. Sarah Whitmore told them she's divorced, starting over at 62 with nothing but an hourly wage and a benefits package she desperately needed for health insurance. The same age when most of her former friends were planning Mediterranean cruises and complaining about estate taxes she'd never have to worry about again. That evening, I stood in my townhouse looking at the physical evidence of the week's destruction. Alexander's belongings still cluttered half the closet, suits that would probably be sold to pay legal fees, watches that would be seized as fraudulently purchased assets, the cufflinks I'd given him for our anniversary that he'd never worn because they weren't expensive enough to impress his partners. On my desk sat the contract for Crystal Gardens, waiting for final signatures. The housekeeper badge lay beside it, a reminder of the moment they'd revealed their true nature. In trying to diminish me, they'd freed me to become who I really was. Not the supportive wife making herself smaller for her husband's ego, but a woman capable of systematic, legal, complete destruction of those who'd mistaken kindness for weakness. The Hawthorne family empire hadn't fallen. It had been methodically demolished brick by brick until nothing remained but rubble and regret. I signed the final papers for Crystal Gardens on a Monday morning that felt like the first day of a new life. The venue was mine now. Every marble column and crystal chandelier, every inch of the space where they tried to erase me. James had arranged for the press conference to be held that Wednesday at 2 o'clock, precisely when Serafina's charity gala planning committee would have been meeting for their final preparations. The main ballroom looked different in daylight, less imposing somehow. I stood at the podium they'd set up, looking out at the assembled reporters, local business owners, and representatives from various Chicago community organizations. The same room where I'd been denied a chair now held 50 people who'd come to hear my vision for the venue's future. Crystal Gardens will operate under new principles, I announced, my voice steady and clear through the microphone. Effective immediately, we're eliminating all hierarchical seating arrangements and demeaning identification practices. Every guest, regardless of their bank account or bloodline, will be treated with equal dignity and respect. I held up a sample of our new name badges. Simple, elegant, just names without titles or designations. No one would ever be labeled as housekeeper or staff or anything designed to diminish them. Additionally, I continued, we're launching the Community Celebration Initiative. Once monthly, Crystal Gardens will be available free of charge to immigrant families celebrating milestones, weddings, graduations, citizenship ceremonies, because everyone deserves a beautiful space for their important moments, not just those born into privilege. A reporter from the Tribune raised her hand. Mrs. Hawthorne, what about existing bookings? We understand there was a major charity gala scheduled for December. All existing contracts will be honored with our new policies in place, I said carefully. However, any events that cannot comply with our standards of equal treatment will need to find alternative venues. We've already issued full refunds where necessary. Serafina's gala, the crown jewel of her social calendar, was officially dead. Her deposit had been returned that morning along with a polite note explaining that Crystal Gardens could no longer accommodate events that practiced social stratification. The woman who'd orchestrated my humiliation would have to find somewhere else to pretend she still mattered to Chicago society. As the press conference ended, my phone buzzed with a call from Margaret Brennan. The federal investigation had released its findings that morning. Alexander's crimes were worse than even I had documented. $3.2 million embezzled over 18 months, systematically stolen from investors who'd trusted him with their retirement funds and college endowments. They're seizing everything, Margaret explained. The townhouse goes to auction next month. Both Porsches, the boat he kept at Belmont Harbor, even his watch collection, the Patek Philippe he wore to show off at partner meetings. It was purchased with stolen funds. The townhouse, where I'd made his coffee every morning, where I'd pressed his shirts while he planned my humiliation, would be sold to the highest bidder. His precious vintage Porsche 911, the one he spent weekends polishing while I saved failing businesses, would end up in someone else's garage. Every symbol of his success was being stripped away, revealing the fraud beneath the facade. His legal defense is costing $400,000 and climbing, Margaret continued. The family trust his grandfather established is nearly depleted. There won't be anything left for appeals. That afternoon, an unexpected email arrived from Helena Morrison, senior partner at Lakeshore Capital. She wanted to meet privately away from the office at a quiet coffee shop in Wicker Park. I almost declined, then curiosity won. Helena looked older than she had at the engagement party, stress lines evident despite her careful makeup. She stood when I arrived, a gesture of respect she wouldn't have offered 2 weeks ago. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "I suspected Alexander was misallocating funds 6 months ago. Small discrepancies, nothing I could prove. I should have investigated harder." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were contact information for 12 CEOs in her network, all running companies that needed restructuring expertise. These executives value integrity over connections. She said they need someone who can save their businesses without destroying their employees' lives. "I've already made the introductions. They're expecting your calls." 3 of those calls resulted in immediate contracts worth over 7 figures each. Within a week, Nexus Advisory had more work than we could handle, requiring me to hire 6 new consultants to manage the overflow. We were no longer my little business, but Chicago's premier restructuring firm, sought after by companies that wanted honest solutions rather than financial engineering tricks. The following Friday, I attended the Chicago Women in Business Conference at the Hilton downtown. I wasn't scheduled to speak, just planning to network and possibly recruit new talent for our expanding team. Then the moderator announced a surprise speaker for the session on professional integrity. Zoe walked onto the stage wearing a simple black suit, her hair pulled back, looking nothing like the girl who'd cried in my kitchen about her rushed engagement. She commanded the podium with newfound confidence. "2 months ago, I was planning a wedding to a man who was committing federal fraud," she began, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium. "I would have married him, tied my future to his crimes, if not for one person who cared enough to tell me the truth." She looked directly at me in the 3rd row. Victoria Hawthorne saved me from becoming collateral damage in someone else's deception, while my own family orchestrated public humiliation against her. She quietly protected me from a catastrophic mistake. The audience of 500 professional women listened in rapt attention as Zoe described discovering Daniel's fraud, calling off the engagement and using the money from selling her engagement ring to fund her MBA at University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. "Real family," she said, her voice growing stronger, "protects you from harm. Real family tells you difficult truths. Real family stands up for you when the world tries to diminish you. Victoria taught me that family isn't about blood or marriage certificates. It's about choosing to protect people, even when they're connected to those who've hurt you." The applause was thunderous. Women throughout the auditorium stood, recognizing something universal in the story of being underestimated, dismissed, and ultimately triumphant. I hadn't sought this recognition, hadn't wanted public vindication, but sitting there watching Zoe claim her own power, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. After the conference, Zoe found me in the lobby. She hugged me with fierce gratitude, then pulled back to show me her laptop screen. "Look," she said, pointing to an email, "I got accepted to the Booth Scholars Program. Full scholarship based on my essay about recognizing and escaping financial fraud. They want me to help develop a new curriculum on ethical business practices." The girl who'd been marrying for status was now building a career on substance. The woman who'd been passive in her family's cruelty had found her voice. The sister who'd stood by while I was humiliated had become the only family worth claiming. That evening, I stood in Crystal Gardens' main ballroom, now empty except for the maintenance staff, preparing for tomorrow's event, a citizenship ceremony for 30 immigrant families who would celebrate in the space where I'd been told I wasn't family enough for a chair. The bitter irony had transformed into something sweeter, something that tasted like justice served at exactly the right temperature. The maintenance staff had finished their preparations, leaving Crystal Gardens pristine for tomorrow's citizenship ceremony. I walked through the quiet ballroom, my footsteps echoing against marble that held different memories now. Exactly 1 year had passed since the engagement party, since the night they tried to erase me with a missing chair and a degrading badge. Tonight, I would host my own gathering in this same space, but this time, every chair would be filled with people who understood that worth wasn't measured in trust funds or family names. James arrived first, carrying a bottle of wine from Yeppe's private collection. The pizzeria owner I'd saved 3 years ago insisted on sending his best vintage when he heard about tonight's dinner. Margaret Brennan came next, having driven straight from court where she'd been defending another whistleblower against corporate retaliation. Tony Romano brought homemade tiramisu from his restaurant, the one that would have closed without my intervention. Lisa Chong, who owned the Chinese restaurant on North Avenue that I'd restructured last year, arrived with her daughter who'd just graduated from Northwestern thanks to the business staying afloat, and then Zoe walked in, transformed from the girl who'd cried in my kitchen to a confident woman carrying herself like she belonged anywhere she chose to be. She wore a simple navy dress, no designer labels necessary to announce her worth. 1 year, she said, looking around the ballroom. Hard to believe this is where it all started falling apart, or maybe where it all started coming together. We sat at a round table I'd deliberately chosen. No head, no hierarchy, just equals sharing a meal. The conversation flowed naturally. Stories of businesses saved and families preserved, of second chances and new beginnings. Tony's son had taken over the restaurant and was innovating the menu while keeping his grandmother's recipes. Lisa's expansion to a second location was ahead of projections. The laughter was genuine, born from shared struggles and mutual respect rather than nervous networking. To resilience, James raised his glass. And to Victoria, who showed us that being dismissed as just staff can be the beginning of becoming indispensable. After dinner, I drove to my new office in the West Loop, a space I'd chosen specifically because it wasn't in the financial district where Alexander's former colleagues congregated. The building was modern but approachable, glass and steel softened by exposed brick and warm lighting. My office occupied the corner of the 3rd floor with windows facing west toward neighborhoods full of small businesses that needed saving. On the wall between my MBA diploma from Kellogg and the framed first check from Yepes, my first paying client, hung the Housekeeper badge. I'd had it professionally mounted with museum-quality glass, the cream card stock preserved perfectly, the elegant script still clear, Victoria Housekeeper. Every struggling business owner who sat across from my desk could see it. When they asked, which they always did, I told them the story, how the badge meant to diminish me had become my motivation, how being labeled staff had freed me to stop seeking approval from people who would never give it, how the greatest strength sometimes came from those others dismissed as unworthy. It reminds me, I would tell them, that your current circumstances don't define your future capabilities. That badge was supposed to be my designation. Instead, it became my declaration. The following morning, Margaret Brennan called with Alexander's latest communication. He'd sent a letter through his court-appointed attorney since he could no longer afford private counsel. Margaret read it to me over the phone, her voice carrying subtle amusement at its contents. "Dear Victoria," it began, "I'm writing from Milwaukee, where I've taken a position as a junior analyst with Midwest Financial Services. It's a small firm, but they were willing to overlook certain past difficulties. I live with my parents now in the house where I grew up. It's humbling, but perhaps necessary." The letter went on for 2 pages, weaving between self-pity and revisionist history. He claimed the engagement party incident was misunderstood, that the name badge was an unfortunate error, that his mother had acted without his knowledge. He begged me to consider dropping the charges, though we both knew criminal prosecution was beyond my control now. Federal investigators didn't care about personal forgiveness. "How should I respond?" Margaret asked. "1 word," I said. "No." She laughed. "I'll draft something appropriately brief." That evening, I stood in my Lincoln Park penthouse as dawn painted Lake Michigan in shades of rose and gold. I wore flannel pajamas and thick socks, comfort clothes that would have horrified Serafina with their lack of designer labels. No one was watching, no one was judging, no one was measuring my worth by my appearance. My laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, displaying expansion plans for Nexus Advisors' second office in Detroit. We'd identified 40 struggling businesses there that could benefit from our restructuring expertise. The city that others had written off as dying was full of entrepreneurs who refused to give up, who just needed someone to show them how to cut the right costs and keep the right people. I thought about the empty chair at that table 1 year ago, the space where I was supposed to sit but wasn't welcome. At the time, it had felt like erasure, like being written out of my own life story. Now I understood it differently. That empty chair hadn't been an absence. It had been an opening, a space to step away from a table where I was never truly welcome to build my own table where everyone had a seat. My phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. She attached a photo from her business ethics class where she was teaching a case study about recognizing fraud in personal relationships, using our story to help others, she wrote. Hope that's okay. I smiled, typing back, Our story belongs to you too. Teach them well. Outside, Chicago was waking up. Somewhere in Naperville, Serafina, or Sarah, as she called herself now, was probably preparing for another day of answering phones and scheduling appointments. Somewhere in Milwaukee, Alexander was living in his childhood bedroom, trying to rebuild from nothing. And here in Lincoln Park, I was planning the next phase of a business built on the principle that everyone deserved a chance at redemption, except those who refused to acknowledge they needed it. The housekeeper badge had been meant to put me in my place. It succeeded, just not in the way they intended. My place wasn't at their table, begging for acceptance that would never come. My place was here, building something meaningful, surrounded by people who saw my worth without needing a name badge to confirm it. The badge had labeled me as staff. In the end, I'd staffed an entirely new life, one where respect wasn't negotiable and dignity wasn't determined by bloodlines or bank accounts. The sun climbed higher, warming the penthouse with golden light. Another day was beginning, full of struggling businesses to save and families to preserve. The work that Alexander had called my little project had become Chicago's premier restructuring firm. The woman they'd labeled the housekeeper had cleaned house indeed, sweeping away everything that no longer served and building something better in its place. If this story of calculated revenge left you speechless, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Victoria placed her wedding ring on that empty table, turning their public humiliation into her Declaration of Independence. What was your favorite moment of justice? Drop it in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell to catch more gripping stories of betrayal, resilience, and ultimate triumph.